They called it faith, medicine, redemption, and secret science. But behind these words lay scenes that today seem monstrous. In monastery cells, men in robes consumed semen as if it were a cure for sin. In women's communities, young nuns inserted live bees into themselves, believing that the pain would purify them of carnal temptations and cure them of infertility. In royal castles, holy doctors prescribed therapeutic rape for girls, explaining it as a way to expel melancholy and demons of the womb. And on the outskirts of Europe, sorcerers secretly performed rituals where flesh was joined with corpses, supposedly to strengthen the union with God or to win a war. All this is not legend. It is documents, letters, chronicles, and medical treatises left behind by an era when the body did not belong to the person themselves. Medical manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries record strange and frightening recipes in which semen was considered not a fluid, but a vital substance. Aristotle's teachings and Avicenna's commentaries, rewritten and adapted for Christian doctors, claimed that semen was a concentrate of heat and strength. Some monks, practicing in secret, used it as a potion for weakness, epilepsy, or black bile. The letters of the inquisitors contain dry lines stating that in some orders, brothers secretly tried semen to strengthen the spirit and body. This was not perceived as an act of debauchery in the sense familiar to us. It was alchemy of the flesh. For women, it was even harsher. Chronicles of monasteries in 14th century Germany describe cases where young nuns were ordered to temper their wombs. Bees were inserted into their wombs as it was believed that the sting strengthened the vaginal knot and protected against demonic visions. The pain was not accidental. It was believed that it was precisely this that drove away lust. Evidence of this has been preserved in court records, where former nuns recounted the torture disguised as religious education. Doctors of the time called it awakening the inner heat. Modern researchers believe that this caused severe inflammation, leading to infertility and death, but at the time, it was presented as a sacrifice for the salvation of the soul. Female sexuality in general was seen as a disease that needed to be suppressed. The idea of a wandering womb dominated medicine at the time. An organ that could supposedly move around the body, suffocate a woman from within, cause seizures, insanity, and even death. Various methods were used to pacify the uterus, ranging from inhaling foul-smelling vapors to forcibly pouring male semen inside. And this sounded not like rape, but like a medical procedure. A doctor could prescribe a girl therapeutic intercourse with her husband or another man. Dozens of cases were recorded where courts justified such actions by doctors, citing medical necessity. At the other end of the spectrum are rituals that today seem unthinkable, even for the dark Middle Ages. Letters from papal legates to the Curia mention rumors that some sects of free spirit brotherhoods practiced acts with dead bodies. This was explained as a symbol of the victory of the spirit over the flesh, union with a body. Deprived of a soul supposedly opened access to a pure channel to God. 15th century chronicles from France contain records of the executions of such groups, mentioning night vigils with the bodies of dead women. Inquisitors recorded this dispassionately as evidence of heresy, but the reality is clear between the lines. Scenes that today would be perceived as sadistic nightmares took place in basements and secret rooms. These were not isolated, ugly exceptions. It was part of a system that linked medicine, religion, and power. The female body was perceived as a vessel of sin, male semen as a source of power, pain as purification, and death as the ultimate and highest instrument of spiritual union. These practices were not marginal rumors. They were reflected in the medical treatises of the Salerno school, the protocols of ecclesiastical courts, the reports of inquisitors, and the private letters of royal physicians. And the deeper you read these documents, the clearer it becomes that we are talking about an entire civilization where the body was an arena for experiments, punishments, and rituals that had nothing to do with what we call intimacy. It was a world where every girl lived with the threat of being healed by violence, where a monk could cover up his perversion by referring to sacred texts, where doctors conducted experiments on women's bodies as cold-bloodedly as they did on animals. It was a world where semen was considered a medicine and a bee sting, a tool for saving the soul. What sounds like barbarism today was in fact enshrined in medical and theological authorities that were considered unquestionable in the Middle Ages. When we read the works of the Salerno school, the largest medical center in Europe in the 11th and 13th centuries, we come across phrases that legalized violence and torture under the guise of treatment. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, one of the most popular medical texts copied and translated throughout Europe, claimed that the female uterus was prone to air damage and seed stagnation. To free it, union with the husband or the application of warm and moist semen was recommended. Avicenna's student, the physician Constantine of Africa, brought translations of Arabic treatises to the Latin West, where female infertility was treated with male warmth. But in Christian culture, this quickly took on a special meaning. Women became objects that had to be fixed through sex, even if they didn't want to. There are court records from 13th century Naples where a woman who refused sex prescribed by a doctor was accused of resisting treatment. The court found the doctor not guilty. In monastery chronicles, one can find lines that reveal horror. In the 15th century records of the Fulda Abbey in Germany, there are mentions of how nuns were prescribed bee purifications. Bees were placed in small cloth bags and inserted inside the women while the insects stung them from within. This was considered a remedy for lust and a method of tightening of the womb. One chronicler wrote bluntly, "They screamed and cried, but the matrons said that purity is born through pain." Even more frightening are official medical compendiums. In the treatise of Trotula of Salerno, 11th century, authored by a female physician, although many attribute her work to later male editors, there are recommendations to treat female melancholy with sexual intercourse. Later doctors, relying on these texts, justified violence against women as necessary for their health. In monastic circles, semen was viewed differently. Texts from the 13th, 14th centuries record accusations against orders that practiced seed collection. This was not always understood as sexual debauchery. Sperm was considered the quintessence of life and could be mixed with wine, ointments, and used in rituals. An anonymous denunciation found in the archives of the Inquisition in Toulouse describes how a group of brothers tasted each other's semen to strengthen their union and purify themselves of lust. To the court, this sounded like heresy, but the text itself shows that the participants believed in the sacred power of the fluid. A separate category is made up of so-called therapeutic rapes. Doctors and priests use the term remedium coitus, means of union. If a woman suffered from uterine obsession, hysteria, convulsions, depression, she was prescribed forced injection of male substance. Historians find references to such procedures in the medical treatises of Guido de Chauliac, 14th century, as well as in court records from Paris and Bologna. One letter from a 14th century Florentine notary states that a young girl was cured of delirium after being forcibly united with her husband on the advice of a doctor. But while treatment for women involved violence, there were other rituals for men. In some sects, later recognized as heretical, semen was used in rituals reminiscent of early alchemical practices. It was added to candles, ointments, and even used in attempts to create life outside the female body. Chronicles mention secret meetings where men in robes dripped it onto the pages of psalters, believing that this would revive the word of God. All these practices coexisted with the official religion. Papal bulls condemned carnal excesses, but locally in monasteries, villages, and even at the courts of kings, the body continued to be an object of experimentation. French chronicles from the time of Charles VI mention the trial of a doctor who ordered the union of a widow with a page, where the court acquitted the doctor, calling his actions reasonable medical advice. Fear and pain accompanied every woman and every teenager of that era. The threat was not only sin, but also treatment. Not only God's judgment, but also human judgment. In medical texts memorized by students in Bologna and Paris, the words cura per coitum sounded not like a crime, but like the norm. That is why, when reading these documents, one gets the impression that we are not talking about isolated perversions, but about a systemic culture. Women were turned into experimental subjects, men into carriers of a medicinal substance. Monks and doctors were the ones who decided who would be prescribed pain and humiliation, and in what manner. When we come across references to night vigils and unions through the flesh of the dead in sources from the 15th and 16th centuries, we get the feeling that we are reading fiction. But the records of the Inquisition, preserved in the archives of France, Spain, and German lands, show that these practices existed and were part of religious fanaticism and perverted mysticism. The Liber Sententiarum Inquisitionis, Book of Inquisition Sentences, contains testimonies in which the accused describe scenes of union with the body of a dead woman. One case in Troyes, France, mid-15th century, concerns a brotherhood that gathered in crypts and performed a ritual of purification through death. Men came into contact with the bodies of recently deceased girls, believing that in this way they were taking their purity and strength. The Inquisitor recorded, "They said that the soul ascends to God, and the flesh that remains here can serve as a vessel for their healing." In the Pyrenees, cases have been preserved against groups accused of sacrificing babies while also performing sexual rituals with dead bodies. One of the 16th century protocols from Aragon contains a dry entry. They had intercourse with a dead woman, believing that death does not separate, but purifies. This sounds like nonsense, but the document is kept in the Toledo archives and is confirmed by other testimonies. In Northern Europe, monastery chronicles record rumors of free spirit sects. Their members were accused of using sperm and blood, mixing them on altars with the remains of the dead. The 15th century German chronicler Helmold wrote, "They touched the bodies of the deceased as if they were sacred objects, and said that this was the only way to achieve true freedom of spirit." What is particularly disturbing is that such practices were not always limited to secret heretical movements. Letters to the Curia mention cases where even monastic doctors conducted experiments on corpses, justifying this as studying nature. Echoes of these experiments can be found in the treatises of 16th century anatomists such as Andreas Vesalius. Formerly, they were studying the body, but many students left accounts of rumors circulating among students about indecent games with the bodies of executed people. Another form was alliance with the dead for victory. Chronicles related to the wars in Bohemia in the 15th century mention rituals on the battlefield, when acts were performed on the bodies of dead women and girls to ensure the strength of the army. In the reports of papal legates, such stories were referred to as monstrous rumors, but evidence from local villages is consistent. Peasants described scenes where knights gathered in crypts after battles and sought strength from the dead. The theme of sacred experiments on bodies is also recorded in the files of the Inquisition. In one 16th century protocol in Milan, a group of doctors was accused of performing a ritual in which they applied semen to the bones of the dead, believing that this would restore their strength and life. For the Inquisition, this was heresy, but the documents show that the participants themselves did not see this as debauchery, but as both science and faith. Thus, rituals involving the dead were not simply a manifestation of secret perversions. They were part of a culture where the boundaries between medicine, religion, and the occult were blurred. The body, whether living or dead, was seen as a vessel, a tool, a material for experimentation and sacrifice. In this logic, death was not an end, but a continuation. Flesh could be used as a path to power, purification, or even salvation. That is why the chronicles and protocols describe everything in a dry and mundane manner, as a fact, as the reality of their time. There are no horrifying comments, only lines stating that such and such happened. But it is precisely in this cold, emotionless record that the true horror lies. These are not fantasies or exceptions, but part of a system where the body was merely a tool for the purposes of others, whether they were doctors, monks, or warriors. Power in the late Middle Ages and early modern period was not limited to armies and taxes. One of the main tools of subjugation was control over the body, especially sexuality. The female body was seen as the property of the family, the church, and the state, while the male body was a resource for war and labor. But it was through sexual practices that power achieved not only discipline but also intimidation. The judicial records of 15th century Paris contain accounts of public punishments in which sexual humiliation was part of the sentence. Men accused of sodomy were forced to wear women's clothing and branded in front of a crowd. Women convicted of fornication were often subjected to therapeutic intercourse right in their cells, which was recorded in the protocols as a fertility test. For the authorities, this was not considered a crime. On the contrary, the body became proof that the authorities could control every vein and every cell of a person. In royal courts, sexual practices were a tool of diplomacy and politics. The chronicles of the times of Philip the Fair and Charles VI describe how favorites and concubines were used not only for entertainment, but also to humiliate opponents. There is a well-known case where a captured enemy was brought into a hall where he was forced to witness a sexual act between the king and his favorite concubine as a symbol of complete submission. In the letters of 15th century Florentine ambassadors, such scenes were mentioned dryly. He was shown the power of the king's body. The Inquisition tied power and sexuality even more tightly together. In the interrogation records of witches, we find dozens of pages where the questioning turned into slow, painful sexual torture. Women were forced to describe in detail their intercourse with the devil, and if their words seemed insufficiently convincing, they were subjected to torture with red-hot iron or vaginal stretching. Some records explicitly state, "She confessed that the devil entered her after she was tied up and tortured." This was not a search for truth, but the creation of a spectacle of fear, where the body of the accused became an arena for a public lesson to others. The practice of public confession held a special place. Women accused of fornication were forced to stand naked in front of temples and sometimes participate in public purification rituals. The chronicles of 14th century German cities mention how girls were brought out into the square after medicinal punishments and doused by a priest with water mixed with male semen, calling it water of life. For the crowd, it was a spectacle. For the church, it was an act of purification. For the woman herself, it was public execution without a knife. In war, sexual violence was not only spontaneous brutality, but also a political weapon. During the 100 Years' War, records show that French and English troops systematically used rape as a means of demonstrating their dominance. One report by the chronicler Jean Froissart states, "The women of the city were gathered and given to the soldiers for their amusement, so that no one would doubt the king's power." Here the body became an extension of the banner. It was torn and broken just like the walls of fortresses. Even in monasteries, power over sexuality was used as a tool of discipline. The abbot could order nuns to undergo body trials, justifying this by saying that the devil works through the flesh. Records have been preserved of how nuns were subjected to violent virginity tests, sometimes repeatedly at the behest of church leaders. This control was not secret. It was considered part of normal community life. All these practices had one goal: to show that the body did not belong to the person themselves, but to the authorities, the king, the church, the city, or the husband. Sexual humiliation became an act of politics, and sexual pain became a means of intimidation. To modern readers, this sounds barbaric, but for people at the time, it was part of the system. And that is why the chronicles and protocols are so dry. They did not see it as a crime. They were recording the norm. The most frightening thing about these practices is not that they took place in the dark corners of monasteries or at secret meetings of heretics. The most frightening thing is their everyday nature. For millions of people in Europe, in the 14th and 16th centuries, life was permeated by the feeling that the body did not belong to oneself. In the diaries of ordinary townspeople and peasants, which have come down to us in fragments, we read dry lines about how a woman feared a visit from the doctor because he might prescribe her a union. How a young man was ashamed that he was forced to participate in seed collection at the monastery. There are no loud words in these records, but it is precisely in them that we hear genuine horror. This is not an exception, but part of the everyday order. Fear of one's own flesh was instilled in children from an early age. Girls were taught to fear their bodies, to say that their womb could drive them mad if it was not subdued by pain or a contraceptive. Boys were taught that their seed was a medicine and a power to be controlled by their elders. Thus, generation after generation grew up believing that pain and violence were not crimes, but part of the normal course of life. This system even left its mark on the language. In Old French and Latin texts from the 15th century, we find expressions such as cura per dolorem, treatment through pain, sacramentum corporis, sacrament of the body, and remedium coitus, means of union. These are not secret codes, but official terms used by doctors and priests. They legalized what we would today call torture and rape. Memories of these practices seeped into folk legends. Tales of night witches who allegedly copulated with the dead partly echoed the actual trial records. Stories about nuns who were stung by bees in their wombs were passed down as frightening parables. Even in the 16th century, when the Reformation began to undermine the power of the Catholic Church, Protestant pamphlets mocked Catholics for their secret seed rites, meaning that the rumors and facts were widely known. The social consequences were horrific. Women who survived medicinal intercourse often remained crippled or infertile. Men who participated in the rituals often lost touch with reality, convinced that their bodies were merely instruments for the will of others. Entire communities lived in fear of public humiliation. An accusation of fornication with the devil was enough to end up in the hands of the inquisitors, who would turn your body into a field of torture. And all this took place against the backdrop of great historical events: the 100 Years' War, epidemics of the plague, and the heyday of universities. While kings waged wars and signed treaties, down below in monasteries and villages, something no less terrible was happening. People were subjected daily to rituals of pain, justified by medicine and religion. Thousands of documents have survived. Protocols, treatises, letters, chronicles. They contain no emotion, only facts. A woman who was assigned a union, a monk who tasted semen for healing, a brotherhood that entered into an alliance with the dead. The coldness of these sources makes them even more frightening. We see how the system worked, unaware of its own horror. Today we call it perversion, crime, necrophilia, and violence. But for those people, it was part of a world where religion and science were intertwined, where pain was medicine and death was a door to salvation. And that is precisely why the memory of it still haunts us. It contains a reminder that culture can legitimize any violence if it is called sacred or healing. In the end, there is only one conclusion, terrifying in its simplicity. Medieval Europe lived in a civilization where the body was not your own. It belonged to the church, the doctor, the king, the husband, the community. The body could be treated with pain, cleansed with death, used in politics and ritual, and no one had the right to say no.